Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Jana Matthews, professor of medieval literature at Rollins College, a four-year liberal arts college with about 2,000 undergrad students located in Winter Park, Florida. Jana is the president of the Faculty Senate for her college, but in addition to her teaching and administrative duties, between 2011 and 2019, she served as a faculty advisor for two sorority and one fraternity chapters on her campus. She used this experience in working closely with the student population to create her latest book, The Benefit of Friends, Inside the Complicated World of Today's Sororities and Fraternities, which was published in September by the University of North Carolina Press. Jana joins us today to talk about the changing role of faculty and how they can help bridge the culture divide with Gen Z. Jana, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm looking forward to our conversation. You're at Rollins College. You're a professor of medieval literature. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to this place.
So I was raised in an insular Mormon community, and I attended Brigham Young University out in Provo, Utah. And after I graduated from BYU, I got my PhD in medieval literature at Duke University, and I really was gravitating towards medieval lit because I love history and I love languages and I love the sort of study of material culture from the distant past. And also, I mean, you can't go to BYU and not love Jesus too, because that's sort of a Christian university. And so kind of brought everything into play. Yeah, right. And
really?
So,
I'd have never guessed that one.
Yeah. And so I just sort of medieval literature kind of fell in as sort of a natural area of study for me.
Okay. And so Rollins College, four-year liberal arts college, around 2,000 undergraduates.
Yeah.
You've done some different things than most faculty have done. Tell me a little bit about your joining a sorority as a faculty member.
Yeah, so it was just as much a surprise to me as anyone else. It says BYU doesn't have a Greek letter system. When you go to graduate school, as everyone in this audience knows, you're kind of in a graduate school bubble. And so I had very little interaction with undergrads. And I took a tenure track job at Rollins College the same year that the college was named one of the top 10 party schools by Playboy magazine. And so I showed up on campus with like the deadly combination of being nerdy and naive. And I, grossly underestimated the ability or the interest of my students to want to study Middle English literature. So I found myself in a place where I needed to recruit students to my courses really, really quickly. And so I was looking around campus, and the one thing that I realized at the time was that everyone around me on the students were wearing Greek letters, and that about 55% of my undergraduate population that I was teaching were members of fraternities and sororities. I started out, this was not altruistic in any way. It was totally, self-interested, where I figured if I could get one or two of them into my class, I might be able to get a bunch of them. And so I started asking questions and just sort of wanting to learn a little bit more about the organizations. One group invited me to start attending chapter meetings. That kind of snowballed. I was supporting them in philanthropic events and service-based events. And then they eventually asked me to join as an alumna initiate. And so in a very surreal experience, I went through the recruitment and initiation process with my freshman class. I have a big. I attended all of the sort of social events as an advisor, and then I became the chapter advisor. And then a few years later, the institution asked me to work with another sorority, and then finally I was moved over to a fraternity. So over a period of 7 years, I worked really closely with hundreds and hundreds of fraternity and sorority women and men.
Well, it's interesting because that is so unusual for a faculty person to do this. They may have pledged in their undergraduate years or something
Right.
like that, but to do it as an alumni pledge, that's different. Tell us a little bit, it gave you some unique insights, which is what we're going to talk about into Gen Z. But, it's not all party school at Rollins. You're
No.
the president of the faculty senate for your college.
Mhm.
So you're seeing both sides of the issues, aren't you?
Yeah, one of the benefits of attending a small college, if you're a student, are also the same benefits that you get as a faculty member, where if you're at a larger institution, you may never have the opportunity to have a leadership experience just by virtue of the sheer number of people that are kind of in competition for those roles. But at a small school, you can jump into those roles early and often. And so I do have the privilege of serving as a faculty president. And my job is to advocate for colleagues and use the governance process to clear the way for them to magnify their work and in the classroom and the research. So I have conversations on a daily basis with faculty with the struggles that they're facing in the classroom, working with this generation, with the opportunities that we see, just trying to figure out where we are in this really unique environment, post-COVID even, and try to help our students live into their potential as young adults.
And that's really, the higher purpose, the public
Yeah.
good of education. Let's dive down a little bit. Let's talk about Gen Z a little bit, because I'm a boomer. I'm not even going to go there. You're way younger than I am. But let's talk a little bit about Gen Z, because as you said, as we talked, a couple days ago,
Yeah.
we forget 3 months ago, these folks were high school students.
When they walk on campus, I think we imagine them as being full-fledged adults, and indeed, there's sort of this rite of passage when they enter into college, and you have a conversation with them, and it is really hard to remember that the difference between high school and college is just really a summer. And so sometimes I think we expect too much of these students. Is when they come in, we expect them to kind of transition from a life in a world where they have parents monitoring them 24/7 and have access to their grades and, or kind of have a lockstep schedule, and then expect them to thrive in an environment 3 months later where if you're on a residential campus, you have no parental control and you have to choose your own adventure. Many of them are rotating or evolving out of really structured activities in terms of sports and clubs, and they don't have that anymore. And so there's an identity crisis. In addition to that, they're growing up and I use the phrase not firing on all cylinders in an affectionate, loving way, but their brains aren't fully developed. And so they're actively making choices and decisions that we may not agree with, but that seem reasonable and logical at that moment. So there's just a lot going on in terms of their life and their brain development that makes it challenging for them.
Well, it's also, too, if you take a look at it from a psychological perspective,
Right.
and you've got Erickson's stages of development,
Yeah.
you've been going through a major one with puberty where you're coming together, you're learning life lessons,
Yeah.
and then you're thrown into the deep end of the pool at university, especially residential. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, you integrated this stuff, maybe. How are you going to do this without the helicopter parent over there telling you what to do each step and learn how to become one, self-sufficient, and two, self-starting?
Absolutely. That is, I think they're still going through puberty in many senses. And we have to really recognize that when they come in and they have like, Accutane faces, or they are, their voices are changing, and, we have to remember they're actively going through this developmental stage that is making it really challenging to govern their bodies and their minds. Yeah, and we're asking a lot of them. And that's not to diminish the sense of responsibility. We can't ask them to do hard things. But I think keeping it in perspective of the challenges that they're facing, that the hardest thing that we're asking them to do is actually not the coursework. It's to do the coursework in spite of all these other things that are going on in their lives and the development, right? And that those are big issues.
They are. And, some of the critics would come out and say, well, I did it. Why can't they?
Yes, I think that we have a fond sense of nostalgia for how it was back then, and it falls into the same category of like, well, I walked to school, uphill and snow both ways, and the reality is that there were challenges abound. I think it is incredibly difficult, perhaps more so than when we were younger, if we had the absence of support and access to mental health resources, to feeling like we're in a culture very much of like, suck it up, just do it, right? Don't talk about it, deal with it. This generation has all sort of the benefits and access to these kinds of resources and part of a culture where mental health issues are destigmatized and that, but at the same time, they arguably have more reason and more and greater access to things that will make them anxious and depressed than perhaps we did, right? So living a life on social media and constantly feeling inadequate, or that the world is sort of coming to you fast and furious, is a really hard thing for them to process and to deal with. And having a good sense of self is really challenging in this particular environment.
Oh, totally. I remember I was bullied in high school, and there wasn't the social media aspect to that.
Yeah.
So I could just change groups and, I'd live my life and deal with those issues later through therapy or whatever.
Yeah.
Social media changes everything with that, because it's not just a small group to change. It's everybody that knows what's going on.
We make a blanket statement about that, and that's not a new revelation. We talk about the kind of the benefits of social media and also the dangers of it. But when we consider that our college students are spending more time online with strangers, right, with artificial or manufactured images, and with engaging with people that they don't know in real life, than they are with people that they flesh and blood like sort of interactions, then I think that creates the danger of creating a warped perspective. There's an endless number of ways in which being on social media can leave you with feeling inadequate or bad about yourself. And so you don't have to go very far to find somebody that is better, insert the blank, at whatever than you are. And that's really challenging, I think. And it's recognizing the depth of the emotional difficulties of like growing up in that world. I think really can't be, it sounds trite to say we need to do better, but it affects every aspect of the students, both development, also performance in the class, and the way that they think about themselves.
And of course, we didn't grow up with COVID.
Yeah.
And that changed everything.
The specific group of college students right now are kind of hit with the double whammy of all the challenges incumbent upon growing up in an era of social media, but also COVID. I really kind of threw them for a loop. One thing I will say in my own classes and talking with my colleagues at here and also at other institutions is that, the freshmen this year spent about half of their high school years either online or in some sort of weird mixed modal, environment. And it's kind of, they're coming to college with sort of really dramatic and profound deficiencies, academic deficiencies. And I think kind of talk about the past 2 years as being kind of a black hole academically. In many senses of what's coming to us, are we're dealing with individuals who have the skill sets of high school sophomores. There's all of that. Like, we're faced with the challenge of getting them up to speed, but also they're also faced with the anxiety, and they're fully aware of the deficiencies that they come in with, and they're very stressed about that. And we can talk about the mental health challenges that come along with being, frankly, emotionally stunted from being socially isolated for 2 years. We've never seen anything like that in our lifetime. And we don't really know what to do about it as a society, but we're definitely seeing the effects and consequences of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously we've talked about more mental health challenges.
Yeah.
It seems like a good segue to move into the role of faculty. The role of faculty now is becoming very different than it used to be before. I mean, you and I have talked. It was the typical for tenure, 40% teaching, 40% research, 20% service.
Yeah.
It's not that anymore, is it?
Yeah, it's definitely not. And I can say that I can speak from my perspective at a small liberal arts college, but I have enough friends and I'm in part of communities where I talk and work with people at different kinds of institutions to say that my experience is in some way relatable or portable to other institutions, where I kind of, the running joke is that we feel like we are unpaid and untrained mental health counselors who happen to teach and do research on the side. And so what?
No.
And there's pros and cons to that kind of model. I think the work that we do, and I think if you ask any educator, they will say that the most important work that we do does not happen in the classroom. And that sounds counterintuitive, right? But we are really training this generation to think critically, to be excellent citizens of the world. Part of that, and a lot of the work happens actually outside of the classroom, in the hallways, in the in the office hours, and those other kinds of things. But yes, like we are increasingly put in a position where we are asked to engage with students and sort of tackle and deal with some, work through with them some of their hard problems. And part of that has to do with the fact that this generation has grown up with access to mental health care, or with the idea that it's normal to kind of share some of your struggles. And they increasingly are living a life online, right? So they're revealing their personal life is public. And so they don't have the hesitation and qualms to share aspects of their personal life with anybody, right? With their parents, with their teachers, with other people. And so we, as the kind of closest adults in proximity to them, are often the ones who are the recipients of this information, want it or not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, joy. But, have you ever had, as a faculty member, any kind of courses, any kind of training that would help you develop these kind of skills that students are asking you to have? Or is it just school of hard knocks?
It's a school of hard knocks. I will say a couple things. I think it's probably helpful to talk about some of the kinds of issues that that are coming to our doorstep. And we are not going out of our way to sort of court them. And we're not standing outside saying like, right, amateur mental health counselor, come talk to me, right? It's literally like when they come into your office to talk about a paper or to ask a question about something, it's the opening question, the icebreaker, like, how are you doing today? And then they will honestly and tell you in striking detail and give you an honest answer to that without any prompting. And so that's everything from, I feel overwhelmed in school, I'm having trouble with roommates and friends. There's financial pressures, to talking about very openly about their anxiety and depression, sexual harassment, sexual assault, alcohol and prescription drug use. I mean, like it can get deep and dark really, really quickly. And so I think the dilemma that we face every day is, what do I do with this information? And we are not prepared to hear this information. I actually asked this question when I was onboarded 12 years ago as an assistant professor, and just said, like, what happens if they bring personal information to the table? And I was, kind of told, well, like, refer out, send them to the wellness center, send them to the student care team, call this hotline or whatever it might be. And that is something that we actively do, but it's not really realistic or sufficient. It's sort of reflecting about like why they came to you and why they chose to tell you that story. I think that's that. And I think the other option is the idea of setting personal boundaries, which we in professional boundaries, and we can talk a little bit about that. But the short answer to your question is like, no, we are not trained. We've not taught this in graduate school. We are not. We don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, and
when we get into this,
well, when you first get into it, yeah, but after a while, you learn. Many folks have gone through these same struggles themselves, and they have that experience. But even so, if I think back to when I was an undergrad, and of course, I jokingly say I didn't get an education, a technical training, because I went to the world's largest fraternity, the U.S. Naval Academy. But, thinking back to those times, what do I remember about my experience there? And it's typical for, I think, most students, is the positive, it's usually all about the faculty. Yep. The negative, it has to do with some of the interactions that we had, the bullying, all of those kind of things that happen. But looking at the positive, those faculty members, I remember, the one that I remember, there are two of them actually. Dr. Smithson, who was my faculty advisor initially in physics, and then Herr Dr. Professor Kalam, who was just the biggest character in the world. He had a heavy German accent with the Bostonian overlaid because he was up there at Harvard and taught there. Just an incredible, incredible human being. It's the same thing with your students. What are they going to remember? They're going to remember their faculty.
I mean, like, not to toot our own horn, but I would say, in this, my experience with my college experience is exactly the same as yours. I remember the faculty member that pulled me aside, and said, you don't look right today. Like, what's going on? And who invited me to their house for Thanksgiving dinner when I didn't have somewhere to go. Right. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. When I ask my students 10 years out, like, what do you remember? They don't say, well, I remember that particular text. Maybe they do, right? Maybe it's sort of this one thing, but they remember an interaction that they had with you. And I think that's a privilege, and it's the biggest gift, I think, about being a faculty member, is that we have this influence over students' lives in a really formative stage of their development. And that's something an institution needs to recognize, really, like, kind of grapple with, is that we're in the business of raising a next generation, and the influence is very significant.
Yeah, and it's not all peaches and cream either. Faculty, you hear people talking about, oh, faculty just a bunch of whiners, back when, ships were wood and men were iron and things like that. Your faculty and therapists go through this as well. How do you not take on some of these challenges and internalize them that your students are having? It's almost impossible.
It is impossible. I would say my brother is a trauma surgeon in New York. And so when he talks about some of his cases, or he will talk about the inability to kind of leave it in the hospital, leave it in the operating room, the same thing happens for faculty members. It's like, we are hearing this information. We're not just sort of passive recipients of it, but we are actively involved in helping them seek out help, get the solutions. It's not often just a one-time conversation. It's an ongoing process. And for better or for worse, that's part of the job now, how is it's defined. And we do take it home. And I think we would be really bad faculty members if we didn't take it home, right? That's part of what makes us so good at our job. I think that if I could point out a sort of cultural problem in higher education that makes this a little bit of a challenge, is that I think that the institutions sometimes send mixed messages to faculty members. And so I sit on a dozen admissions panels a year, and I travel with the admissions team to do recruiting. And the stories that they want me to tell in those events are about how I have my classes over to my house for dinner, and how I take them on field studies to far-flung places, and how I chaperone fraternity and sorority events, and otherwise engage with them outside of the classroom. And, you cannot do these things without opening yourself up to some of those hard conversations, right? Like, it's not, your students are going to tell you things in those environments, and you don't have to push very hard to do that. And then at the same time, they're saying, well, set up professional boundaries and don't have these conversations with them, or don't, be receptive. And you can't have it both ways. So you can't have an active faculty body that is tending to the needs and the holistic needs of the student, and being asked to do this kind of work, and then tell them at the same time, don't listen to those conversations, right? And don't be affected by the things that you hear, in your office or in the hallways. But yeah, it's a huge challenge.
And without getting formal training, which there would be from an administrative perspective, there'd be, positive and negative. Positive is you'd be able to help the students. Negative is you're leaving the university open to potential lawsuits because you're not a trained clinical therapist.
Yeah.
So what do faculty need to do to be able to help these students, but at the same time, take care of themselves?
It's the golden question. I think first,
I should have left it till later.
No. I think that, there's different levels of question. And what I'm not advocating in any way is that professors take on the role of a trained mental health counselor and, walk that student single-handedly through a sort of a life-threatening crisis or issue. That's not our role. I don't think anyone wants to do that. And those are all things that we kind of like refer out. And my job when those situations come into my office is to get you to somebody who's trained, right, to kind of to deal with those things. And then encourage them. My role is then to encourage them to continue with that treatment, right, and support them in saying, you're doing the right thing, keep on it, right? I know this is difficult, you can do it. I think it's sort of the accrual or the accumulation of sort of the sheer number of things that come into your office on a daily basis, right? You might hear about all of the things I mentioned above within one day. Part of it is just, I think it is important to listen. This generation has been conditioned to talk out their problems and to recognize that. They're conditioned to talk out their problems. And so we need to be able to be prepared to listen to them and create the time and space to do that. And so if somebody wants to tell me something, I'm going to hear it. And then I can make a different choice about what I do with that information. But the one thing an institution needs to do is recognize that those conversations are happening. That's a dynamic, and also account and create space for those things to happen. As far as professors and professor life, I don't have a good answer to that, because that is about sort of work-life balance. We don't work on a 9-to-5 schedule. The institution is like Las Vegas, where it's, runs 24/7. Even if we have our phones off and aren't checking our email after a certain hour, we often are attending events at night, on the weekends. Things are just kind of constantly in motion. And I don't know any professor who sort of expects to hold to sort of the corporate model of like, I'm going to clock in at 8 and sort of clock out at 4. Or our schedule is all over the place. So when you bring your work home with you, and in part when you're doing some of your work at home, there really isn't a space where you can get away from the challenges. Like, they follow you, they're everywhere. And that's a problem that everyone's facing now in a post-COVID environment, when there's more work from home, right? The line between work and home is sort of like fuzzy and mutual. I think we're working out as a society, but it's something that I would like administrations and boards to be aware of, is that there is no separation of space. And because there's no separation of physical space, there's no separation of mental space. It's hard to compartmentalize, and it's difficult.
Yeah, it's to turn it on, turn it off. It is very, very difficult.
You can't.
The mind is the most difficult tiger you will ever have to tame.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, setting boundaries with students, one-way relationships. You mentioned that the other day. You're okay to listen, but you're not their friend. You're there to listen, to refer them when they need it, or sometimes just to allow them to download.
Students will think that they know a lot about me. Right? They'll say, oh, I know a lot about Dr. Matthews. She likes cats, and she likes to bake, and she, likes to water ski. And these are all things that I will tell them in a public environment, in class, sort of as an anecdote or things like that. It's all very, very superficial. They don't know about my hopes and dreams. They don't know about my inner feelings. They don't know about my, emotions, like anything like sort of like that delves any sort of deeper than like this kind of superficial level stuff. And so there's this appearance of familiarity that can help them feel comfortable talking to you, or but when they come in and sit into my office, it is very much sort of taking a cue from the clerical or from the pastoral framework of like, I am there to listen quiet and passively, and to nod my head and to express empathy and sympathy for the situation. And then to help them, to sort of help them process those emotions, and then provide them with options and help guide them, their decision making. Most of the time they know what they should be doing, and they have the answer to their own questions. They just need somebody to kind of, what I'm hearing from you is this. And it seems to be, right? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? I kind of like guide them to a place where they need or they want to be. And then affirm that the decision or what they're leaning towards is sort of right or wrong.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. And what would help faculty and what would help students that administration could do?
I think, the biggest thing is really and truly recognizing that this kind of work is happening and that it takes up a lot of our time. One thing, I've kind of sit in a quasi-administrative role now. And so I'm in meetings all the time with administrators. And I would propose this idea. So think about the amount of time that you spend in a week in meetings, right? So is it 10 hours? Is it 15? Is it 20? And you walk away from those meetings and you're like, I don't really, those meetings are important. And I know that work is done, but I don't know how to quite qualify that or quantify that on a resume. I don't know how to put that down and document that. It just feels kind of like, time that's spent, but they don't really know what to do with it. And that same amount of time, I think faculty are spending with students, not only in their office hours are just the beginning. It's everything that kind of happens in and around office hours. They're interacting with students. And so to recognize that, I think sometimes when we look at faculty, we say, oh, they're only in the classroom, whatever, 3 or 4 hours a week. And, it feels like they've got the cushiest job in the entire planet. The reality is that as somebody who helps to manage and support 150 faculty members right now, I have a detailed chart of all of their service obligations, of what each individual is sort of in charge of, because I need that when I have to go sort of populate committees and find out what they're doing. And out of that list, I like cringe when I have to like make asks, because every single person is doing so many things. And there really is a very tiny percentage of faculty who are not pulling their weight. And of that percentage, a lot of times it's for really good reason. It's because they're grappling with a major life event, or they've got something traumatic happening to them. And so the very, very few faculty members that we call frequent flyers, those are kind of reach on the radar of administration all the time for kind of being slackers, for a better word, give everybody else a bad name. And it's really easy when you're in an administrative bubble to sort of just see this and sort of apply that to everybody. But I am here to testify that faculty work incredibly hard and take their work very seriously.
Yeah. Having been a former faculty member, I can attest to that.
Yeah.
So I am just blown away. We are at the end of our time. It's gone so fast, Jana, and thank you. 3 takeaways, university presidents and boards.
I think one kind of big grand idea would be to find ways to structurally recognize the kind of work that faculty members are doing. The dream would be able to incorporate this work into a tenure and promotion process. They'll say, oh, it's already in there in the form of advising. Advising is different than mentoring or academic advising. I'm talking about this sort of mentoring work. I think that they could also look at doing some sort of mentoring awards or some sort of formal recognition to incentivize and sort of acknowledge and recognize people that do that kind of work. And then maybe the last one is just an open and frequent expression of compassion and understanding, where we would always love increased raises. That would be everyone's hope and dream all the time, right? We know that's not a sort of fiscal reality oftentimes, but small tokens of kindness and recognition of appreciation. So we can take something from the corporate playbook. Corporations will have free donuts. They'll, kind of provide you with kind of daily, kind of constant reminders of their generosity. I was privileged to be part of one of the most successful initiatives last year to kind of do this. We lobbied and successfully were able to talk the provost into giving faculty 2 free lunch swipes a week in the cafeteria. And that really simple thing, right? It's the idea is that you are taking time out of your day later on to work with students, often through lunch, to do these kinds of things. And so here we're going to give you some of your time back and some of your resources. Enormously popular, relatively little cost to the institution, and just increase morale in a really dramatic way. So small but simple things are really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Those are great takeaways. I'm going to add one more to it, is administration train faculty on how to be, I don't want to say a level 1 trauma expert or something like that, but train them, give them the skills that they need to be able to deal with these things and refer them out when appropriate. I mean, that plus, training faculty to become leaders, it's all in the job description. So I'll get off my soapbox with that.
No, I will also just conclude by saying that training faculty members implies a sense of recognition. And so we haven't been training, I would argue, because we don't want to fully acknowledge that it's happening. So there's a first step to that, and they both kind of go hand in hand.
Good point. Thank you. Jana, what's next for you?
Well, I am working on a second book on fraternities and sororities, and so I'm thrilled and really excited to be able to do that. And I love my position as faculty president, and I'm rotating off at the end of the year, but I'll probably will have my hands in something at the institution, and I see what comes.
Well, I wish you all the best with all of that. You've done such an incredible job, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this interview. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Jana Matthews and for her sharing with us her insights on the critical role faculty are taking in bridging the cultural divide with Gen Z. Our next guest, we have a special treat, Dr. Belle Whelan, president of SAC-COC. Belle will be joining us to talk about the state of accreditation and what's on the horizon that presidents and boards need to be aware of You won't want to miss this one. Until next time.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.